The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
What can Georgia do to build a resilient, innovative and stable economy? This was one of the main questions with ADB's chief economist visiting Georgia. Here is a sit-down interview with Albert Park in Forbes Georgia studio ahead of the economic growth outlook for Georgia, which will be released next week. I would like to start our conversation with a very specific topic, and that's a middle corridor and the importance that the Black Sea region is gaining and the momentum that it is gaining in light of the sanctions and all sorts of developments, unfortunate developments that we see in Ukraine and beyond. How is Georgia positioned in this bigger picture today?
Well, I think the middle corridor and developing it to be an efficient transport route is a real opportunity for Georgia. Obviously, the opportunity is being created by the current circumstance where there's a strong incentive to ship goods through Georgia to Turkey through the rail line or to the port to the Black Sea. And I think it's a moment where it's important for Georgia to do what it can to facilitate trade, both in terms of making sure the infrastructure is well developed, but also a lot of the regulations and other barriers, procedures that often can impede trade across borders. The more it can progress in that area, the more it can benefit from developing the middle corridor. At the same time, just becoming a hub for shipment is, it's not the same as really creating sources of productivity growth and innovation that can drive growth over the long run. So given that Georgia has strong institutions relative to a lot of countries in the region in terms of governance and finance, et cetera, the greater kind of flow of goods through the country, through the middle corridor, could provide additional opportunities to provide other types of service sector support to that activity. But at the same time, I think Georgia, of course, needs to push on many different fronts to continue investing both in people as well as in capital that can promote high productivity activities.
Yes, you mentioned infrastructure, and the Georgian government has resumed talks about building Anaklia port again. Do you think this is the right way to go now, at least?
Well, I don't know about all the politics behind some of the infrastructure projects, but of course, infrastructure is very fundamental to providing support for economic growth and for greater regional economic integration with other parts of the world. And so the more that can be done will certainly be beneficial from that aspect, especially, obviously, the Black Sea is a very key trade route. So the more that Georgia can develop its capacity to ship goods through there will be beneficial, I think.
You also mentioned that there are some other economic drivers that need to be in place so that the growth is more stable and more sustainable. What are these? What could be these main drivers for Georgia?
Well, one thing is investing in human capital. Georgia still is primarily a service sector economy, so you would like to develop kind of more higher productivity, high-level business service activity. That certainly requires well-trained workers, but really at all different types of, even if you think of things like tourism or even basic trade activities, there's certain types of skills that need to be developed. And so I know the ADB has been supporting efforts to improve the vocational education system in Georgia to help provide more workers with skills that are being demanded by employers. And the government has a very, I think, good plan to try to bring the private sector, different business sectors, and involve them more closely in the design of the standards that are being taught in the vocational colleges and to expand the number of training centers in the country.
What about the diversification of the economy? You mentioned services center earlier. You mentioned innovations and all sorts of like diverse
Sure.
spheres of the economy. Do you think this is the right time for Georgia to diversify further from Russia's economy?
Well, there's different types of diversification. I think if you're talking about regional diversification in terms of who you're trading with or investing with, I think the process of diversification away from Russia started even before the war. The war perhaps may accelerate it, but you know, Georgia signed free trade agreements with the EU, with China, and trade has really been growing in those aspects as well. And I think most people would say that diversification in general makes a system more resilient, and everyone cares about resilience after the pandemic shocks that we've been witnessing and the war shocks that we've been witnessing in recent years. There's another type of economic diversification, which is diversifying across sectors or sources of growth, and I think for Georgia, there's a concentration in services. I think there's a question about whether Georgia can develop more manufacturing capabilities, and certainly since there's quite a lot of the labor force in agriculture, trying to support agro industries so that materials are processed in Georgia and then exported is an opportunity, and some of the things that we know Georgia is good at, like producing wine, I think those areas can also be further developed to generate higher quality products and have larger global markets for production.
Wine is actually a very good example for my question, because it is heavily dependent on Russian market, and
right.
You know, we see that's why when here in Georgia, when we mention diversification, we almost always mention how we can diversify away from Russia because of the
sure. Well, for wine, I don't think we want to produce less wine, right?
Not only because of economics, but politics as well.
Right. I mean, wine is so great here. I've really enjoyed drinking some of it since I've been here, but. In that case, diversification isn't really about reducing wine, but trying to find other export markets and meet the quality standards and taste standards of other parts of the world. And I think there's certainly potential for that.
Fitch Ratings wrote about Georgia that currently Georgia is actually benefiting from Russia-Ukraine war, and Georgia's economy is benefiting from it. What is ADB's view on that?
Well, we're upgrading our growth forecast for Georgia as well as many other economies in the region, partly because we overestimated the negative impacts of the war, you know, and it was natural because being right next to Russia, having so much trade and investment links, I think there was a thought that it would be a big negative shock. And we underestimated the positive aspects, and so I think now we're realizing that there have been clear benefits. The most notable has been, you know, the increase in financial flows or remittances into Georgia, and that partly is Russians moving money into Georgia, but it's also Russians coming to Georgia as tourists or staying here, or even moving businesses to Georgia. Businesses also moving from Belarus, and so there's been a flow of people and money into the country, and that has supported more consumption because these people have to spend money on housing and food and other things. And so I think that has helped boost growth in Georgia. And the other positive benefit of the war for Georgia has been this diversion of trade through the middle corridor.
Looking forward, do you see that that effect maintained in the long run on Georgia's economy?
That's a very good question, because you could imagine that some of these could be reversed if the war ends. we don't know what that's going to look like, of course, and whether sanctions how long they will persist even after the end of the war. I think in most of our modeling and forecasting, we are predicting that some kind of sanctions regime will continue against Russia for some time into next year. But then, eventually it could be that Russians who have come to Georgia will all go back, right? And so they'll take their money with them, and that will reverse some of the positive benefits. It could be that trade routes open up again, and so there's less demand for the middle corridor. So I think, obviously, from a strategic standpoint and thinking about trying to make these benefits more persistent, I think you need to seize the opportunity now and try to lock them in, right? So if you can really facilitate trade through the middle corridor and make progress, so you become very efficient, and then people who have now trading through this route, they find, hey, this is great. Maybe they won't even want to go back to the old route once, because there are certain natural comparative advantages to this corridor, right? And that's why you really want to really facilitate, pursue a lot of trade facilitation measures to make this a desirable route forever, right? And similarly for Russians and the funds or other businesses that come in, I think you want to try to figure out if there are certain parts of that business that create capabilities or opportunities that could be supportive of growth over a longer period. Then maybe if it's a good environment here, maybe those will also stay longer. But everything has been changing so fast.
Exactly.
And will continue to change. It's a little bit hard to predict, obviously, what the future will be, and thus how much of the current changes will revert back to the way they were before.
Yes, we mentioned several times sanctions on Russia. What is your take? Are these sanctions working? Are they effective? And for what?
Well, I'm not an expert really on the political implications of the sanctions. Economically, I think
definitely.
The main result of the sanctions has been to really create a spike in energy and commodity prices, I think, or to make that maybe even greater than they would have been without the sanctions. But that's natural, given the goal of the sanctions is to just block the flow of resources. At the same time, Russia has been pretty successful in selling its oil, diverting some of its energy to Asian markets, and there are many countries that have not joined the sanctions. And so it's not clear, at least on the energy side, how much the sanctions have actually hurt Russia, if that was the goal in economic terms, of course. I think some of the other sanctions over time will be probably painful for Russia, and so I think it's creating reduced forecasts for the economic performance in Russia, certainly, because there are many things still that Russia needs, like airplane supplies, these things which are going to become more and more of an issue. So I think it's certainly going to hurt the Russian economy over time. How much and whether that has some political implication is very unclear to me. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, especially the rest of Asia, has been negatively impacted by these big increases in energy and food prices. Asia has been able to weather that storm pretty well thus far. But after 2 years of dealing with a pandemic and then this shock as well, I think many governments are stretched a bit thin in terms of the availability of their public resources to really deal with all of these issues, to support vulnerable groups, at the same time keep reinvesting in future growth. It's just it's a challenge, I think, for everybody. But I think we're still optimistic. Asia is still growing fast relative to the rest of the world, and still will be kind of, I think, the leader in driving global growth. going forward.
Looking at Georgia and the region, where would you position Georgia in dealing with this like multiple shocks that we've seen hitting the world? First pandemic, now this war.
Well, I think if you just look at the data, Georgia's done quite well, right? Because like most countries, they had a big negative growth rate in the first year of the pandemic. But last year, growth was over 10%. The first 7 months of this year, growth rate's over 10%. The level of GDP now is higher than it was before the pandemic, which you cannot say for many other countries in Asia. And moreover, they seem to be in a pretty good macroeconomic state in the sense that they don't have a huge debt relative to their GDP, like some other countries that are dealing with some debt issues. The central bank is a very capable manager of the economy. Of course, there is inflation, which is now projected higher, but a lot of that is due to just the higher energy prices and food prices. But we're advising governments throughout the region to be very, very vigilant about the inflation risks and not to fall behind the curve and to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of hand. And we're already seeing that in many economies in the region, that central banks are now starting to step up and try to make sure they are not too slow in addressing the inflation issue.
Looking forward, what is ADB's focus of cooperation with Georgia? What will be some of the main topics of the working agenda with Georgia?
Right. Well, Asian Development Bank has been a long-standing partner of Georgia, trying to support Georgia's development. We've done in the past a lot of infrastructure projects, especially road infrastructure, and we're still committed to supporting infrastructure goals and developing the middle corridor, et cetera. We're also, as I mentioned, trying to increase our support for vocational education and the development of human capital and skills in the labor force, which we also see as an important contributor to raising productivity in the future. The Asian Development Bank is also now aiming to become the climate bank for Asia and to put a real focus on supporting countries' plans to address the climate challenge. And so we're also very keen, both our public lending, but also our private sector operations, to support efforts to invest in renewable energy and to help Georgia make progress on that aspect as well.
When you say a renewable energy, what do you mean under that? I mean, do you mean both hydro and I don't know, wind, sun, whatever. Do you mean hydro as well? Because we know that it is a tough challenge for Georgia. We've had a major case with Namakwani.
Of course.
So yeah.
Right.
So is it
your
focus as well?
I don't know enough about the details of the specific projects. I don't think we're currently, have a proposal to fund big hydropower in the region, but I think hydropower, there's also smaller dams which are maybe less environmentally threatening, and unfortunately I'm not familiar with all of the details of them. Okay. But just in general, I think we stand ready to support the government's efforts and the private sector's efforts to develop renewable capacity when there's a consensus that this is the right thing to do for Georgia.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.